Madam President, last week I told the story of a mother who received critical support from an organization called Lifespan in Chicago after her daughter was sexually assaulted by the mother's husband. The services provided by Lifespan were paid for by the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA. This week I want to tell you another story that is even more troubling, but it dramatizes the need for us to act today, this afternoon, to resolve a problem that is serious. I'm going to use the name Sasha, not the real name of the woman involved. She was in Chicago, mother of 3 kids, and she was living with a man who was unpredictable and dangerous. He got so drunk that he tried to kill her. Not once, but 3 times. He tried strangling her the first 2 times and she ran away. The 3rd time, she passed out. When she woke up with the kids nearby, she knew that was it. She couldn't take it anymore. So she went to a hospital, hoping to get some help there. She was scared to death. She brought her kids with her because she didn't want to be around the man that did this to her. She heard about a group called Harbor House in Chicago. Harbor House is basically a domestic violence survivors center. I would tell my colleagues in the Senate, if you have ever visited a domestic violence survivors center and met with any of the victims, you'll never forget it. I swear you'll never forget it. I can remember the first time I met with one of the victims in one of the shelters. She was crying, her eyes were red, and one eye was blackened. And she choked back the tears and told me the story of what she'd lived through. For some reason, and I'm not a psychologist, I can't explain it, she blamed herself. And it happens so often. What happens to these women who are the victims of domestic violence and abuse? Where do they go? Some of them can't find anywhere to go and end up dying as a result of it. What happens to their kids who witness these acts of violence in the home when mom's getting strangled by this man? What happens to them? Well, luckily, we care enough in America to do something about it. Through VOCA, the Victims Fund, we send money to Harbor House and Lifespan and other agencies and say, do your best. Help them put their lives back together again. Protect them. Well, I want to fast forward and tell you 6 months after Sasha's experience, things are much better. She lives safely in an apartment that's provided by this agency. She still works with adult counselors and youth counselors to get herself and her kids through this. And she knows that she's not alone. These VOCA-funded advocates stepped into her life at just the right moment and saved her life. They may have saved the lives of her children, too. So when we cut back on funding, for whatever reason, we are jeopardizing the services that I just described that are so critical. With decreased VOCA funding, if we do nothing today, with decreased VOCA funding, Harbor House will have to cut 3 of its staffers, including a legal advocate, adult counselor, and youth counselor. Exactly the type of professionals that help Sasha and her family. The executive director said, if VOCA is cut, imagine being Sasha and having to go through this alone. That's why you've got to pass this bill. That's why it's so critical. As I noted last week, VOCA passed in 1984 to establish the Crime Victims Fund. We can't even count the number of people who've been helped over the years. 3,000 applicants come through my state attorney general's office in Illinois, and every state has a similar story to tell. Thousands of victims helped by service providers, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, trafficking, and drunk driving. The Crime Victims Fund doesn't receive a dime of taxpayers' dollars. How about that? What I just described for you doesn't come out of the Treasury. It funded through criminal fines, penalties, forfeited bail bonds, and special assessments collected by the federal government. Historically, most of the money comes from criminal fines, But in recent years, deposits have dropped off significantly. That's why we're here at this moment. They need help, and they need it now. Monetary penalties from deferred prosecutions and non-prosecution agreements are currently deposited in the Treasury instead of the fund, and as a result, the shift has had a devastating impact on the fund. That's why a bipartisan, bicameral group of members of Congress working with advocacy organizations have come up with this VOCA fix. Our bill would stabilize the depleted fund by redirecting monetary penalties from deferred prosecutions and non-prosecution agreements to the victims and services providers that need the help. The reduced deposits into the funds have already had a devastating impact. Victim assistance grants have been reduced by more than $600 million in this fiscal year, $600 million nationwide. And more cuts are coming if we don't do something today. Like Harbor House, advocates across the state and across the country are begging for help. We don't have any time to waste. Every day that goes by, we miss an opportunity to help replenish the fund and to put these services on the street. So far this year, the fund has already missed out on a total of nearly $550 million in deposits that could be helping these agencies. And we're not even halfway through the year. That's why it's imperative that we pass this bill. The House already did it in March, 3 months ago. Broad bipartisan support. Here in the Senate, we have a broad bipartisan coalition of 57 senators, 37 Democrats, and 21 Republicans. We all get it. We're all for crime victims. But we've been stopped because of an objection on the floor. Let's end this today. Whatever the merits of any budgetary argument, for goodness sakes, lives are at stake here. Unfortunately, this objection about moving forward was made last week and probably will be made again today. It involves Senator Toomey's concern about a budgetary issue. It's a complicated issue about something called chimps, for goodness sakes, which he can explain, and I'm sure he will. But after last week's argument on this, I went to the advocates who were telling us that we should send this money as quickly as we can and said, is he right? Is this designed without his amendment so that this money will not go to the people who need it? They said he's wrong. This is not going to happen. And here's their statement. During floor remarks for the unanimous consent last week, it was represented the VOCA Fix Act fails to correct certain structural issues that prevent the funds from reaching victims and their advocates. Underlined, the premise of this statement that these structural issues impact the distribution of VOCA funds to survivors and advocates is not accurate. This is from the actual agencies themselves. While the use of chimps as budget offsets continues to be a contentious issue, they said, the claim that appropriators hoard money rather than releasing it to victim service providers is false, inaccurate, and false. In reality, appropriators have substantially decreased the size of the budget offset by releasing far more than the amount required by this proposed substitute. And the proposed substitute intends to restructure the entire appropriations process is incredibly controversial. In other words, we're going to dive into the deep end of the pool on budget process and budget rules and budget regulation while people are literally drowning in violence, victims of domestic abuse. For goodness sakes, isn't there a better time and place and a better group to hold hostage? It shouldn't be these domestic violence victims. If you listen to this explanation, there's one thing missing, and it's critical. There's a suggestion that this money for the crime victims funds is being spent for another purpose. You never heard that, did you? It said it could be, maybe it will be, it might be, but it hasn't been. Listen to what they say. These people in the advocacy groups who, believe me, are jealously watching every penny. They want every dollar, just as you do, and I do. And what do they say about your argument? The premise of your statement that these structural issues impact the distribution of victims' funds to survivors and advocates is not accurate. It goes on to say, the claim that appropriators hoard the money rather than releasing it to victim services is false. It's from very agencies receiving the money. Are they in on the deal, Senator? I don't think so. They're desperate for these funds, and without them, they're going to have a serious cutback in services. The proposed substitute, intended to restructure the entire appropriations process, is incredibly controversial, and you know it, and I know it as a member of the Appropriations Committee. And yet you're tangling up this entire appropriation for the victims of crime, victims of domestic abuse, women who are seeking shelter and help and hospital care and trying to care for their children and what they're going through. You want to hold back on the possibility somebody's going to spend this on something else, even though you have no proof that it's been done. None. And the people who are the advocates for these groups are saying to you, what you're saying is inaccurate and false, and you won't give it up. I'd suggest pick another target. Find some other group to make your budget point of order. Please don't take these people who are in the most desperate situations in their life. This is not the time and place to raise this budget debate. I sincerely hope that you'll think about them for a moment. I object to your modification.